Yeah.
Sure. Go ahead, Martin.
Okay. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us in this presentation on the psychosocial aspects of child work, which we will do together with Susan Gunn. Here, the first slide of the picture, you can see a child sitting on the ground. The reason why we put this picture over here is that this child is basically staring into the mature world, into the world where he or she will grow into. This is why this picture really caught my attention. I thought this is very important, especially when you look at the psychosocial aspects of child work, where you really have to be able to look from the child's perspective and the child's development. The first slide here is, can you see it? We took this quote out from the UNCRC. The committee notes the growing body of theory and research which confirms that young children are best understood as social actors whose survival, well-being and development are dependent on and built around close relationships. Which means also if you're looking at mental health, psychosocial issues of children, you cannot look only at the individual child. You always have to look at like who's around the child, with whom are they acting with, which are the peers around them, the families, etc., mothers, children. That is very important. The content of the presentation will first start with the concepts. What are the psychosocial aspects of child work and why are they important? Secondly is developing a tool methodology, how the instrument for the psychosocial assessment of child work was developed and why. Results, what we can learn, one example of the type of information that can be obtained. That's what Susan will focus on. And then the questions and comments. So the concepts, what are the psychosocial aspects of child work and why are they important? Well, first we have here the impacts. We have an overview of the impacts, which is impacts of child work, 3 major categories, which is the physical impact, social educational impact, and the psychosocial impact. Physical impact is often visible and measurable. Social educational impact is measurable, but less visible. And lastly is the psychosocial impact, which is not usually visible and hence also a bit more difficult to grasp and less visible and less measurable. Here, so this was the focus of the research. This is what we focused on. This was the topic, which made it challenging and difficult, but nevertheless very interesting. Theoretically, children's work can have negative effects on his or her physical or psychological health and development, or have positive implications on his or her social integration and well-being. That is very important also for the work we have done. We've not only tried to look at like what are the negative aspects or what are the positive aspects. No, we need to look at it from a balanced perspective. We need to take into consideration all that this could be, you know. So when we're looking at child work or children, we always need to consider a developmental perspective. How is the child going to grow as a mature person, as an adult? We look at economic, physical, social, educational, mental, psychosocial aspects, which are cognitive, emotional, or spiritual. The main questions, here's child work, are how do children develop into mature human beings that can positively contribute to their society? And in what way can child work have an effect on children's psychosocial development? When you have child work, it can have obviously positive effects, as we talked about, but it can also have negative effects. And what we should not underestimate, I think, and what we found in this work we've done, is that the negative psychosocial effects are not just temporarily, sorry for the pronunciation, they can have a long-term effect on children. I mean, I am working currently as a psychologist with adult people here in the Netherlands. And even though these people were not, obviously, I mean, they're not being they've not done any childhood work when they were young, but you can see the effects with all the adults I'm working with of the struggle they have during their childhood, of the things they've experienced during their childhood. And once a person has developed mental health problems or psychosocial problems when he or she is very young as a child, if that remains untreated, it can have a lasting effect for the rest of his or her life and becomes a psychosocial disability. One thing we could look at is, like, there are many ways of dealing with it, but you could, for example, think about how to deal with it as, for example, using prevention measures. But there are many more interventions you could use, obviously, things we could do. We'll talk about that probably also later. The potential psychosocial benefits of child work. Well, there's contributing to family welfare, knowing that he or she is a key component of the family's economic coping strategy. Sense of competence gained from learning new skills. I mean, can be very important, knowing that you can do something, knowing that you're capable of doing things. That gives also raises the self-esteem of a child. Pleasure of being with peers and family members, super important. The peer support we found is very important as well, that children have a group around them. They do not feel isolated. Gaining a sense of independence through earning own money. But there are also risks, potential psychosocial risks of child work. Child works may be criticized, yelled at, denigrated, intimidated, target of jokes. In a low-status job with little or no control of what they do, unable to object or protest, have no union support, given insecure, precarious jobs without contracts, doing work that is frequently monotonous, repetitive, yet may also require intense concentration and speed, carrying a heavy sense of responsibility for the welfare of family, especially younger siblings. And actually, this taking care of younger siblings is what we call in psychology also parentification. Parentification is what we see also with adult patients in psychology, that when they were young, they were taking the position of the parent, which is unhealthy. A child should not take the position of a parent. So that is one very important thing as well. Working in isolation from family, peers, and social contexts, exposed to adult behavior like drinking, swearing, drugs, and faced with sexual abuse or sexual harassment. And you can obviously add here to physical abuse of harassment. What are the key psychosocial impacts domains of child work? Well, we used here as, which is a very important work being written by Professor Martin Woodhead for the Understanding Children's Work, the collaboration between the ILO, UNICEF, and the World Bank Group. He has written excellent work based on which we have done our work, like which we further developed the research project. And he has developed basically 5 key domains where he says, like, these are the key psychosocial impact domains of child work, which are the cognitive abilities and cultural competencies, personal security, social integration, and social competence, personal identity and valuation, sense of personal agency, emotional and somatic expression of well-being. The development of the tool, Susan and I and others, like people from the University of Nottingham, HealthNet TPO, Saeed Awan and his colleagues in Pakistan and others, the whole group have worked on the development of a tool. This tool is called the Instrument for the Psychosocial Assessment of Child Work, the IPAW. Why was it developed? How was it developed, and why? The requirements, I'm not sure if you can really see that, the requirements in the top of the slide. It was able to be used, it should be able to be used on a population, not individual basis, and this indicate economic sectors where child workers were at significant psychosocial risk, and which categories, such as age, sex, types of household, were most at risk. Able to be administered by persons who were not psychosocial professionals, and able to be easily adapted to different cultures. Those were the requirements for the tool. The process of development. There was a long process of development which started more than 10 years ago. I started with Susan after my internship at the ILO in Bangkok, working on this, and then we took it up together. And Susan led the whole project. We started with the identification of relevant existing instruments with child psychology and occupational psychology. An extensive literature review was done by Stravula Leka Aditya Jan from Nottingham University. And I did additional literature review and interview-based research. Then we had in 2011 an assessment of the existing instruments. We decided a new approach was necessary. There was then the ILO technical consultation on children and youth in hazardous work was organized at the ITC ILO Center in Turin. We drafted an initial instrument based on Woodhead's domains, like the ones I've mentioned, the domains before. We conducted a pilot and validation test in Pakistan and Nepal. I was part of that as well in Nepal. Then we used the 48 item IPAL in ILO 4-country study to compare children working in brick factories with those who were not working, a total of 1,555 participants. Results were analyzed to assess reliability and coherence, use Cronbach's alpha, and determine most salient questions, maxi and mini. Adapted the mini to include in all national ILO labor force surveys, child labor components. So we needed to include some of the items, psychosocial items for the ILO labor surveys, and analyze 2-country sample of child workers to assess age, sex, and education differences. And now this is the third section, results. What can we learn? One example of the type of information that can be obtained, and that's what Susan is going to do.
Hey, I'm going to keep my camera off because we're having troubles with the connection. So I want to emphasize that the psychosocial aspects have been virtually ignored by all of the large-scale surveys. And although they've been including physical impacts, you know, our children being hurt by the tools that they use, or they, you know, what kind of remuneration are children getting? But the psychological impacts have been virtually ignored. And so one of the reasons for doing this big study was to demonstrate that the psychosocial component of children's lives, their perspectives on their lives, could be done, was important, and to try to show what kind of information we could get. So I'm going to run through this quickly because there are a couple of papers that would be available for you. We expected, and I wanted to demonstrate, frankly, that work could have positive effects, but we did not find that. We found instead that the differences between the children in the comparison group and the working children, that there were very significant differences. And that these differences, the negative effects, increased each year. So if I can ask you to the next slide. So there were some indications in the 4-country study that girls were being particularly disadvantaged. So in the analyses then, we drilled down deeper and found that actually on all domains that we studied, girls were in a more negative position than were the boys. And we did I must say that the Bangladesh, the 4 countries were Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal. And the Bangladesh had too few girls to really study, and the Nepal was very culturally different. So we chose the Afghanistan, Pakistan to look at the impacts of age, sex, and education. And we found that that it had a consistently negative effect, except in the case of education. Next slide, please. So that it appeared that the effect of education, whether a child went to school, a working child went to school, it had a tendency to erase the negative effects of the work. And so, except in the case of older girls. And in that case, because of this, we don't know why, but it appears that maybe they felt that the school was an insecure environment. Next slide. So the conclusions that I'm going to kind of draw very quickly is that this demonstrated, in fact, that psychological damage could be measured using a survey method, and that it turned out that working with the family did not have the advantages that we thought that it would have. And secondly, that once we looked at the different categories of children, that is the age, the sex, and the education categories of children, we found that there was variation within these. So therefore, that means that you can't, your implementation, your actions to protect the children or to remediate the situation have to take into consideration these categories. You can't just make one size fits all, treat all children the same. And finally, we demonstrated that girls were in a worse situation than boys on all variables. Now, why is this important? Next slide. It's important because this demonstrates to policymakers, to employers, and even to parents as well, that there is something that needs to be done. You can't, it's no longer opinion. It has the cachet, if you will, of science to show that you've got to give first priority to girls, and you've got to give girls a sense of security, particularly older girls, when they go to school. In other words, they need a safe environment, particularly in this culture. So just to reiterate that this tool was not intended as a diagnostic tool for individual children. It's to demonstrate on a broad brush, just like we're doing with physical impacts of work, that we're trying to demonstrate that psychological effects can occur. They may be negative or they may be positive, but they must be broken down by the characteristics of the age, the sex, the education, the household composition. And so they can also, for example, be used as a way of demonstrating that children should not be removed from work immediately. For example, particularly in those circumstances where the children are benefiting psychologically from the work environment, to remove them immediately, or to, even though the work might appear physically dangerous, it would be very deleterious to them psychologically. So you see, it gives you a more nuanced, a finer tuned basis for analysis and for action. So with that, I'll leave it there, and we look forward to your discussion about the questions that we are posing to you.
These are the questions.
If you want, we can read these.
Yeah, do you want to highlight the questions then, Martin or Susan?
Okay, so I'll do it. Now, all of you have probably undertaken some kinds of research or an action program to remediate the situation of children who are working. And so we were asking you to reflect on your experience. And we're asking whether or not you have ever undertaken a psychological inquiry, and if so, why you chose to do so, and if not, why not? And we very much appreciate your documenting that. And then what you learned about the children in terms of the psychological profiles. You know, did your results match ours in the fact that girls were more affected than boys? And secondly, the second question is, what conclusions in relation to what you have observed or, you know, have heard about, what conclusions would you make for action in order to protect children from psychological injury? And particularly, this is, you know, a matter that is often argued that we don't have the time, we don't have the money to go into this. So given that priority, what would you do? And the third one is what have you seen that has benefited the children psychologically? Describe what seems to be contributing to that benefit. Okay? We look forward to hearing your answers. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to Martin and Susan for, I think, opening up really this topic that probably sits in the background for too long, and great to see the concrete results that have come out of this. We're now going to be dividing into our working groups or our discussion groups, and Olivia will go through and assign people. I think we're about 20 members now, so we may be 2 or 3 groups. The idea is to go through the questions that Martin and Susan have now posed. It's not necessary to cover all 3 questions. You may decide in your group you want to focus on one, but we are going to try and keep notes from each of the discussion groups that we can then share back with Martin and Susan. Olivia, are you ready to break us out?
Yes, just checking if there's no Q&A first, if there was a direct question to Martin and Susan before we move to the breakout rooms.
Yes, I didn't see anything in the chat, but if anybody has anything to bring up at this stage.
I do have a question for you, Martin and Susan, in the tool. So I wonder if there was a possibility when you unpack the negative effect. I took a picture of the slide because that was really interesting to me to see that so much could actually be done by programs meant to support the kids, particularly on the first one around child workers being criticized and not necessarily recognized for their worth by the community members, but also by society at large. And I think a lot of the anti-child labor programs are aiming in that direction, pointing to the fact that children shouldn't be working and creating a more of that negative environment towards recognizing and accepting working children. And so I wonder if in your research you had a bit of ability to dig into this the source of that yelling, criticizing things, and if you were able to see that indeed maybe public messaging or that type of source, which would come from places that are meant to support working children, would actually have that effect. I don't know if my question was very clear. Something dear to my heart because it makes me so upset.
Let me start, Olivia, by saying, as you know, the ILO is 3 components. It's governments, employers, and unions, or workers' organizations. And one of the messages that has to go to employers is that denigrating a child, saying, you're stupid, you're doing a bad job, or just sort of routine criticism, that can be extremely damaging. So, what our aim is to keep the older children at work in a safe environment. A 15-year-old who is being constantly criticized is going to, his self-concept or her self-concept is constantly under attack. So therefore, the policy recommendation or the training recommendation is directed at the employers to make it an encouraging and supportive environment for their younger workers. I'm not sure. Am I addressing it, Olivia?
Yeah, I think somehow, I think I was more asking about what if research data was showing some of the effect, but indeed in terms of actions, I think a lot of the harmful psychological effect that we see can be addressed, but that's more the question you asked to the group. So happy to move that to the next session, but it was more in terms of the research, if you were able to identify some of the source of that negative aspect that was linked to the yelling, criticizing, which is all linked at the end to the fact that the working children are not necessarily well recognized in societies, and including so in their workplace, in their communities, and eventually at the policy level, when the policy is extremely focused on making sure working children are not working anymore. So that was the source, and maybe that's for another research to be seeing what's. To me, it's a question of accountability of programs. When we have programs directed at working children, a lot of them, and I've seen them in Colombia, in other places where you have very strong public messaging around child labor, but at the end of the day, it's against a child. And I'm very curious to see that accountability in terms of psychological effect of those massive campaigns can have on the actual living children who are seeing those campaigns and who are still working. So that's the one piece where I was curious to see if the tool would capture that, or if that would be for maybe another research.
I must say we tried to capture it. We didn't have any. We don't have any particular guidance on, from the research on that. But I would say that a survey method is not designed to get these causal factors. It's only, in a sense, I always think of it as a flashlight. You know, you're trying to shine light on an area that more detailed research has to be taken.
Yeah.
And perhaps now we can move into our.
Nicholas is asking something.
Oh, sorry, Mike.
Nicholas has got his hand up.
Thanks, Michael. I have a quick question. Did you, in your surveys, did you have a somehow comprehensive approach of the relationship, the social relationship of the children that were asked about their psychological well-being, or was it just aimed at the children?
The question was, did we look at what kind of family structure and what kind of friends they had? Is that what you're asking?
I mean, did you take that into account? Yes. I mean, on a psychological level, I'm sorry, I do not know that much about psychology myself, but I suppose it has to be considered at some point, I assume.